The night was calm, almost deceptively calm, as if the world itself had paused to breathe. Cities glimmered softly with lights reflecting off the oceans and rivers. People walked home from late-night shifts. Couples lingered under streetlights, and children slept soundly in their beds. For the first time in years, the news had not spoken of wars or disasters. The streets were quiet, the air untroubled, and a sense of relief hung over humanity like a fragile bubble. In the heart of a bustling city, a man sat at a desk cluttered with monitors, wires, and small blinking devices. He was a communications engineer at an international space agency, someone who had spent countless nights scanning frequencies, decoding signals, and ensuring that Earth's satellites operated without interruption. To most, his work seemed ordinary, routine even. But in the quiet hours of the night, when the rest of the world slept, he understood that the smallest signal could carry the weight of life or death. That night, as he leaned back in his chair and rubbed his tired eyes, a faint beep echoed from the receiver on his desk. At first he ignored it. Electronic equipment often made strange noises, and minor glitches were part of the job. But then it came again, a rhythmic pulse that didn't match any known pattern. The engineer leaned forward, adjusting the frequency. The signal grew clearer, faint but undeniable. It was not random static. Someone or something was sending a message. He felt a strange chill run down his spine. The office was empty except for him. The city outside slept peacefully, unaware of the tiny disturbance in the quiet night. He opened the decoding software and began analyzing the signal. Lines of code appeared on the screen, fragments of data that refused to make sense at first. It wasn't in any language he recognized. It seemed alien. The more he worked, the more he realized this was not a simple interference. The pattern was intelligent, deliberate. His heart pounded. Could it be a hoax, a prank? He had to know. Hours passed as he worked tirelessly, translating signals, marking timestamps, and comparing them with historical transmissions. The night slipped away into early morning, and a pale sun began creeping over the horizon. Finally, he could read it. The message was terrifyingly clear. It was a declaration of war. The words were not direct, they were coded, cryptic, but the meaning was unmistakable. Something far beyond Earth had decided that humanity had crossed a line. They were coming, and the time to prepare was now. He froze for a moment, staring at the screen, unable to move. He thought about the city outside, about his family asleep in another part of the city, and about all the people who had grown comfortable in the safety they had taken for granted. The realization hit him like a cold wave. Humanity had been blind to a threat that now hung over the world like a shadow. He knew he had to act quickly, but where could one man send a warning when no one would believe it? He decided to alert his supervisors immediately. He picked up the phone and called the control center, explaining what he had found. At first, the response was skeptical. Communications errors were common. Satellites often picked up signals from distant sources that meant nothing, but as he showed them the decoded fragments, the doubt in their voices vanished. The room went silent, tense as each person stared at the data, realizing the gravity of the situation. Within hours, the calm of the city began to crack. Government agencies went into emergency mode. Military officials were alerted, and communication channels were flooded with urgent messages. Despite all of this, the general public remained unaware. There were no alarms, no warnings, no sense of the approaching storm. People went about their morning routines, blissfully ignorant that the world they had known was about to change forever. The engineer returned home briefly, taking a moment to see his family. He watched as his partner brewed coffee, and his child played quietly with a small toy spaceship. There was a strange beauty in this normalcy, a reminder of what was at stake. He didn't speak of the signal, not yet. How could he explain a threat so immense, so incomprehensible, without sounding insane? All he could do was hold his child a little tighter, kiss his partner on the cheek, and return to the office. Back at the agency, the situation escalated quickly. Satellites began picking up unusual energy readings near the edges of the solar system. Unexplained fluctuations in the ionosphere, strange bursts of radiation, and faint but continuous transmissions confirmed the engineer's fears. Something was moving toward Earth. No one knew exactly what it was, but it was intelligent, organized, and aware of humanity. Military analysts ran simulations, trying to predict the behavior of this unknown force. But every model ended with the same chilling conclusion. Earth was unprepared. The engineer became the linchpin of humanity's first line of defense. Every decoded signal, every anomaly, every strange pulse was sent to him. He worked around the clock, barely sleeping, barely eating. His eyes grew tired, his hands shook, but he could not stop. Each transmission brought new horrors, new possibilities, and a single terrifying certainty. Humanity's peace was ending. In the quiet moments between messages, he reflected on the fragility of life. How quickly the ordinary could dissolve into chaos. A single misstep, a single failure to notice a pattern, could cost millions of lives. He thought of the countless generations who had looked up at the stars and wondered if life existed beyond Earth. They had dreamed of contact, of discovery, of friends among the stars. But now that contact was coming, and it brought war, not friendship. As the sun climbed higher, news agencies began reporting unusual disruptions in satellite communications. People noticed GPS errors, internet outages, and strange flickers on television screens. Panic began to ripple through cities in small waves. Still, no one could understand the source. To most, it was technical failures, temporary glitches. Only a handful knew the truth. Something was watching, waiting, and moving closer with purpose. The engineer sent his first urgent warning to the government. Prepare for contact. Do not attempt to engage without strategy. But even as the message left his desk, he knew it might be too late. The signals he received were not just transmissions, they were probes, scouting, learning, adapting. Each message seemed to anticipate humanity's response, challenging the assumptions of every scientist and general. Night fell again, and the city lights twinkled under the same calm sky that had hidden the threat. The engineer stayed at his post, exhausted but vigilant. He reviewed the incoming signals one last time before sleep could claim him. A new message appeared, faint but insistent. The screen displayed a single phrase, repeated in a loop through complex code. After hours of decoding, the meaning became clear. It was a warning and a promise. You will pay for starting this war. The words burned into his mind. They were not a threat in the way people understood threats on Earth. They were final, absolute, and full of intent. He looked around the empty office, feeling the weight of the message pressing down. The world outside was oblivious. Children laughed in playgrounds and adults went about their daily lives. But everything had changed. Humanity had been marked and there was no turning back. The engineer sat in silence, staring at the blinking monitors. He realized that from this moment on there would be no ordinary days, no peaceful nights. Every decision, every action, every breath would be under the shadow of an approaching storm. And in that silence he made a promise to himself. He would do everything he could to ensure that Earth survived, that the people he loved had a chance to see another sunrise. He began drafting plans, documenting every signal, and preparing protocols for global communication. He knew that the first hours would determine the outcome. He knew that panic could destroy humanity faster than any weapon. And he knew that somewhere beyond the stars an enemy was waiting, watching and ready to strike at the first sign of weakness. As the night stretched on, the city slept under a sky that no longer felt safe. The engineer remained at his desk, eyes weary, hands trembling, heart heavy. Somewhere far away, something had declared war on Earth, and he, a single man with a screen full of blinking lights, had become the first line of defense. The calm was over. The storm was coming. Humanity had only hours to prepare for a reality it had never imagined. And for the engineer, there was only one certainty. Nothing would ever be the same again. The days after the first warning passed in a strange haze. The city still moved as if nothing had changed, but the people who knew the truth were frantic. Governments worked in secret. Military units mobilized quietly, and scientists scrambled to understand what was coming. The engineer, still at his station, felt the weight of the world pressing on his shoulders. He had seen the signs, decoded the messages, and now he waited for the inevitable. It began early one morning, just as the city started to wake. At first it was subtle, a small flicker on the monitors, satellites reporting strange energy surges. Then came the first unmistakable sign, a massive orbital disturbance. The engineer and his team watched in disbelief as reports came in from multiple stations. A satellite had been destroyed by a force they could not identify. The explosion sent fragments tumbling in orbit, and the screens lit up with warnings. Panic rippled through the control center. Officers shouted into phones, sending orders to nearby stations, trying to assess the damage. The engineer's hands shook as he decoded incoming data. It was clear that this was no ordinary accident. No satellite had ever failed like this. The pattern, the timing, it all pointed to an intentional attack. Someone or something was striking at Earth. News of disruptions began leaking to the public. Television signals cut out unexpectedly. Internet networks slowed, and radio stations broadcasted static in place of normal programming. People were confused and scared, but they could not grasp the full scope. Most assumed it was technical failure, unaware that the world's communication systems were under a coordinated assault. The engineer knew better. He could see it in the numbers, the pulses, the energy readings. The attacks were precise, controlled, and deadly. Then the first real strike came. The engineer received live reports from military satellites showing massive explosions in remote regions of the planet. Cities were hit with strange energy waves that caused fires, blackouts, and destruction. Though there was no conventional weaponry involved, panic set in. People ran into the streets screaming and looking for answers. Emergency services tried to respond, but the attacks moved faster than anyone could react. It was as if the enemy had predicted every possible defense. In the chaos, the engineer's mind raced. He had spent years studying signals, decoding messages and predicting anomalies, but nothing could have prepared him for this. He watched helplessly as the world he knew began to crumble. His thoughts returned constantly to his family, safely relocated to a secure zone by the authorities. He wished he could be with them, but he knew his duty was here at the control center, ensuring that as many messages and warnings as possible reached the surviving networks. The attacks were not random. Every strike seemed targeted, designed to break communication first. Satellites fell from orbit, power grids failed, and cities went dark. The engineer realized that the attackers did not want to kill immediately. They wanted chaos, confusion, and fear. Humanity was being forced into a corner, stripped of its ability to respond and left to wonder what was happening. As night fell, the destruction continued. Reports streamed in from across the globe. Major cities losing contact, aircraft grounding themselves due to failing navigation, ships in the oceans drifting without control. The engineer's monitors displayed images of fires, collapsed buildings, and blackened streets. He felt an overwhelming sense of helplessness, but he pushed it aside. There was work to do. Every second mattered. Every signal he could send might save lives. The government held an emergency meeting, linking their networks to the engineer's system. Military leaders, scientists, and communication officers crowded into a secure room, watching him decode incoming transmissions. For the first time, everyone understood the magnitude of the threat. No conventional defense could stop it. The enemy was unlike anything Earth had ever faced. It was intelligent, adaptive, and relentless. The engineer's warnings were no longer theoretical. They were urgent and real. By the third day, the attacks escalated further. Small towns once considered safe were hit by the same destructive energy bursts. Transportation networks failed. Hospitals struggled to maintain power. The engineer continued to send warnings, patching together transmissions to remaining satellites, trying to preserve communication lines for emergency response teams. Each successful transmission was a small victory, a thread of hope in the growing darkness. Despite the chaos, stories of human bravery began to emerge. People helped strangers escape collapsing buildings, guided lost neighbors through smoke and debris, and rescued those trapped in danger zones. The engineer saw this reflected in the messages he received from field units. Even as the world fell apart, ordinary humans were acting with extraordinary courage. It reminded him that Earth's greatest weapon was not technology or armies. It was the people themselves. One evening, as the city lay in partial darkness, a new signal appeared on the engineer's monitors. It was faint, almost drowned out by interference, but it was deliberate. He quickly began decoding it, and what he discovered made him shiver. The message contained coordinates, timings, and calculations. It was not just a threat. It was a map of destruction, showing the next targets with terrifying accuracy. Whoever was attacking Earth had knowledge beyond human comprehension. The realization hit him hard. The attacks were not random, and humanity was already in the middle of a war it had not started. The engineer understood that survival would require more than science or weapons. It would require strategy, unity, and courage from every person on the planet. Every decision mattered, and there was no room for hesitation. As the night stretched on, the engineer worked tirelessly. He contacted surviving stations, patched together emergency communication networks, and coordinated with military units. The world outside was burning, but he refused to stop. Every message he sent, every warning he transmitted could save lives. The knowledge that countless people relied on his work gave him purpose, even as exhaustion threatened to take over. By the fifth day, the attacks had reached a horrifying scale. Major urban centers were reduced to ruins. Communication networks were nearly gone. The engineer received reports of mass evacuations, chaos in the streets, and desperate families trying to survive without power or guidance. Yet, amid the destruction, he also received messages of survival, hope, and resilience. Small towns had managed to organize shelters. Communities had created local communication networks using battery-powered radios. People were refusing to give in to fear. Despite the despair, the engineer remained focused. He began to understand the patterns in the attacks, predicting where the next strike might occur. He coordinated with military units to create temporary defenses, evacuating civilians from predicted target zones. Every success was small, but it was proof that humanity could fight back even against overwhelming odds. Late at night, as he reviewed the latest transmission, the engineer received a new message. Unlike the previous ones, this one was personal, almost taunting. It repeated the words he had seen before. "You will pay for starting this war." It was clear now that the attackers were aware of him specifically, that every warning, every intervention he made was being monitored. The threat was no longer abstract. It was direct, targeted, and chilling. The engineer sat back, breathing heavily, staring at the screen. He felt a mix of fear and determination. The world was collapsing and countless lives were at stake. Yet he understood that giving in to despair would achieve nothing. He had a role to play, a duty to humanity, and he would not abandon it. The attacks were brutal and relentless, but so was the human spirit. As the city slept fitfully under an uneasy sky, the engineer remained at his post, eyes fixed on the monitors, hands trembling but steady. Each incoming signal was a challenge, a puzzle to solve, a step toward survival. The destruction outside was immense, but hope was not yet lost. Humanity was being tested, and for the first time, the engineer felt the weight of true responsibility. The first strike had shown the world that no one was safe, that the enemy was precise, intelligent, and merciless. But it had also revealed something else. Humans, even in the face of overwhelming power, refused to surrender. The engineer knew the road ahead would be longer, darker, and far more dangerous. Yet he also knew that every warning he sent, every life he helped save, was proof that Earth would fight back. As dawn broke again, painting the city in muted light, the engineer finally allowed himself a brief pause. He looked out the window at streets still quiet, people still unaware of the scope of the disaster, and felt a flicker of hope. Humanity had been struck, yes, but it was not yet defeated. He returned to his monitors, ready to decode, transmit, and protect. The first strike had come, but the war was only beginning. And the engineer would be there for every moment, the silent guardian in the storm, the voice trying to hold a world together as it faced a force unlike anything it had ever known. After the first strike, the world seemed to shatter into silence. The streets were eerily empty in some cities, while in others, panic spread like wildfire. People ran through darkened neighborhoods, calling out for loved ones, searching for explanations that did not exist. Power outages were widespread. Traffic lights flickered before going dark, leaving roads chaotic. Fires burned in places where electricity had failed, and the smell of smoke mixed with the acrid scent of fear. At the heart of the chaos, the engineer worked tirelessly. The control center had become a hub of desperation. Technicians, scientists, and military officers crowded around blinking screens, trying to maintain communication. It was a battle that was not visible to most people, a fight over information, signals, and survival. Every beep, every coded pulse could carry instructions that might save or destroy lives. The engineer's role was critical. If the lines went down completely, humanity would be blind and silent against an enemy that was already watching. The collapse of communication began slowly, but relentlessly. Radio signals cut out mid-broadcast. Television stations flickered, then went dark. Internet servers crashed as networks failed under strain. Satellites, once reliable, tumbled helplessly through orbit after being hit in the initial strikes. Emergency services tried to coordinate, but the gaps in communication made planning nearly impossible. Hospitals scrambled to keep operations running without outside guidance. The engineer watched each system fail, knowing the enemy was systematically dismantling Earth's ability to respond. Messages from around the globe trickled in sporadically. A small town in Europe reported that their local radio station was the only thing still functioning. In Asia, military units were cut off completely, unable to reach headquarters or coordinate defense. In North America, cities tried to implement backup communication systems, but they were quickly overwhelmed. The world was being forced into isolation, each country, city, and town cut off from one another, vulnerable and exposed. The engineer focused on maintaining what remained of the networks. He patched together satellite signals with surviving terrestrial lines, creating small islands of communication that could reach key military and government centers. It was a constant battle. Every time he managed to reconnect a system, another one failed. Every success was a brief triumph, quickly followed by another challenge. He slept in short bursts, ate hastily, and drank coffee to stay awake. He understood that exhaustion could lead to mistakes, and in a war like this, mistakes were deadly. Meanwhile, people struggled to adapt to the new reality. Panic was everywhere. Some tried to flee cities, unaware that roads were blocked or bridges had collapsed. Others formed small groups for protection, barricading themselves inside buildings. Rumors spread quickly, fueled by fear and misinformation. Stories of entire neighborhoods disappearing overnight, of strange lights in the sky, and of fires burning for miles created hysteria. Yet in the midst of fear, there were also acts of courage. Strangers helped each other escape collapsing structures, shared food and water, and worked together to survive. The engineer noticed a pattern in the attacks as he analyzed the signals. They were precise, almost surgical, targeting communication infrastructure first, then creating chaos on the ground. It became clear that the enemy wanted humanity disoriented, unable to respond in time. Each strike was calculated to weaken the planet's defenses before any counterattack could be organized. The engineer realized that survival depended not just on technology, but on human cooperation and quick thinking. To keep communication alive, he devised a system of emergency transmissions. Using a combination of surviving satellites, shortwave radios, and backup generators, he created a network that could send critical information to emergency teams. It was far from perfect. Signals were weak, sometimes garbled, and often delayed, but it was enough to provide guidance to some communities, enough to prevent total chaos. Every successful message felt like a small victory, proof that humanity could still fight back even in the dark. As the days passed, the collapse became more severe. Major cities were in partial blackout. Transportation systems ground to a halt, airports unable to communicate with air traffic control, grounded flights worldwide. Shipping lanes were disrupted, causing panic over food and fuel supplies. Factories shut down as production lines failed without coordination. The engineer watched each failure in real time, feeling both helpless and determined. He knew that if communication completely broke down, the enemy could strike with impunity, and there would be no warning, no defense. In the quiet moments, the engineer thought about the human cost. He imagined families trapped in high-rise buildings unable to call for help. He thought of people in remote villages cut off from news or guidance. He thought of children scared by sudden darkness and strange lights in the sky. Every signal he sent, every patch he fixed was meant to reach them, to give them a chance to survive. The weight of responsibility was immense, but it was also a source of strength. Despite the collapse, signs of resilience emerged. Communities adapted quickly. Local leaders organized watch groups and improvised communication lines using radios and runners. Hospitals set up manual record systems and established schedules to ration supplies. Neighborhoods formed chains to relay messages, ensuring that even when technology failed, information could still travel. The engineer observed these efforts through scattered signals, feeling a mix of relief and pride. Humanity was refusing to be entirely defeated. The enemy, however, did not relent. The engineer intercepted signals that suggested they were monitoring every action. Each time a network was restored, the transmission seemed to anticipate it. The enemy was learning, adapting, and striking back with calculated precision. The realization was chilling. This was not just an attack. It was a test, a challenge, a war fought in real time across communication lines and physical space. In one particularly tense moment, a transmission from a distant satellite showed a massive energy pulse heading toward a major city. The engineer had only minutes to warn authorities. He sent the message through every available channel, patched through radio, shortwave, and remaining satellite connections. Then he waited, heart pounding, as reports came in. Miraculously, the city managed to evacuate key areas in time. It was a fleeting victory, but it demonstrated that even in the midst of collapse, human action could make a difference. As the world slipped further into darkness, the engineer became a symbol of persistence. Military officers and government officials relied on his expertise, while communities trusted his transmissions for guidance. He was exhausted, often feeling as though the weight of the planet rested on his shoulders. Yet he could not stop. Every message was a lifeline, every successful connection a shield against total destruction. The nights were the hardest. Without functioning streetlights or power, the world outside the control center was almost unrecognizable. Fires glowed in the distance, sirens echoed intermittently, and the air was thick with smoke and tension. The engineer would pause only briefly, staring at the stars, thinking of the enormity of the universe and the fact that somewhere beyond it, an enemy was orchestrating all of this. He felt fear, yes, but also determination. Humanity would not be defeated without a fight. Weeks into the collapse, the engineer observed the subtle ways people adapted. Children learned to navigate by landmarks instead of GPS. Families created signals to communicate across neighborhoods. Communities stored food and water, established watch schedules, and maintained morale through small acts of kindness. Even as the collapse destroyed so much, it also revealed the strength, creativity, and resilience of ordinary people. Through it all, the engineer continued to monitor the signals. He noticed strange patterns, bursts of energy, and new transmissions that suggested the enemy was increasing pressure. Yet he also detected signs of hesitation, as if the attackers were studying human responses. Every calculation he made, every warning he transmitted contributed to survival. He realized that the collapse of communication was not just a disaster, it was a battlefield, and knowledge, information, and coordination were humanity's weapons. By the end of Part 3, the world was a fractured place. Cities lay in ruin. Communication networks were largely destroyed and fear was widespread. Yet amid the darkness there were islands of hope. Communities fought to survive, leaders improvised, and the engineer worked tirelessly to keep the last lifelines alive. The collapse of communication had been devastating, but it had also shown one undeniable truth. Humans, even when isolated and under pressure, refused to give up. The engineer sat alone in the control center one night, surrounded by monitors, showing fragmented signals from around the world. His hands were tired, his eyes bloodshot, and his mind heavy with the weight of what had been lost and what remained. Yet he did not despair. Humanity had survived the first strikes, adapted to the collapse, and begun to fight back in small, determined ways. The battle was far from over, but the human spirit had not been broken, and in that moment he understood what the next phase of survival would demand. Not just technology or expertise, but courage, unity, and an unyielding determination to protect life. The collapse of communication had tested humanity, but it had also revealed a truth that the world had changed. Cities were scarred, communication lines were fragile, and the skies seemed heavier with tension than ever before. Humanity had survived the first strikes, adapted to the collapse of communication, and found small ways to resist. But the engineer knew this was only the beginning. The enemy's attacks were increasing in precision and intensity, and the planet's survival depended on a coordinated, determined response. The engineer returned to the control center after a brief rest, finding it more crowded than ever. Military officials, scientists, and emergency response coordinators had set up temporary stations, all linked through the fragile network he had maintained. Everyone was aware of the danger. The enemy was not only attacking physically but also testing human resilience, probing weaknesses and exploiting any lapse. In this chaos, the engineer realized that communication was still humanity's greatest weapon. Across the planet, groups of survivors organized themselves into small networks. Some were volunteers who guided civilians through ruined streets. Others were technicians salvaging equipment, keeping generators running, and restoring partial communication lines. Every small victory mattered. The engineer monitored these efforts, relaying instructions, providing coordinates, and ensuring that the scattered pockets of humanity could remain in contact. Even as most of the world remained silent, the idea of a final array began to take shape in the minds of military strategists and scientists. This massive transmitter, still under construction, was designed to send a single powerful message beyond Earth. It would carry the voice of humanity, the warning and promise to whoever had initiated this war. The engineer was asked to lead the operation. His knowledge of signals, his experience decoding the enemy's messages, and his calm under pressure made him the natural choice. He accepted, knowing that failure was not an option. Preparation for the operation was grueling. The engineers and technicians worked day and night, salvaging equipment, reinforcing generators, and ensuring that the transmitter could withstand attacks. The engineer oversaw every step, double-checking calculations, monitoring signal integrity, and coordinating with military teams to ensure safety. There was no room for mistakes. Every cable, every relay, every calibration mattered. If the transmitter failed, humanity's voice would be lost forever. As the team worked, reports of enemy movements reached the control center. Massive energy pulses had been detected approaching Earth. Cities that had survived earlier strikes were now under threat. It was clear that the enemy intended to prevent the final array from being completed. The engineer realized that this mission was not just about sending a message. It was a battle for survival. A final stand against overwhelming force. The engineer thought constantly of the people he could not reach, the families scattered across the planet, and the children sleeping in the ruins of their homes. He felt a surge of determination. This message was not a threat of destruction. It was a declaration of humanity's spirit, its refusal to surrender and its unbreakable resolve. It was for every person fighting to survive, every life that mattered, and every moment of courage that had kept hope alive. As construction continued, the team faced obstacles at every turn. Supplies were limited. Equipment malfunctioned. Power surges caused delays. But the engineer reminded everyone that their work mattered, that each small adjustment brought them closer to sending a message that could change the course of this war. He worked alongside them, setting an example with his tireless focus and quiet determination. Fatigue was everywhere, but no one dared to stop. Meanwhile, the enemy's attacks grew bolder. Energy pulses reached cities close to the transmitter site, causing buildings to shake and fires to flare. The engineer coordinated evacuation plans, guided emergency services, and sent warnings to any remaining survivors in the area. Despite the chaos outside, the team inside the facility remained focused. They were aware that the enemy wanted to disrupt the operation, but they refused to let fear dictate their actions. Humanity's voice had to be sent, no matter the cost. During quiet moments, the engineer reflected on what humanity had endured so far. The collapse of communication, the first strikes, the widespread panic. It had tested every human strength, courage, patience, ingenuity. People had adapted, improvised, and survived despite seemingly impossible odds. He realized that the final transmission would not only be a message to the enemy, but also a testament to everything humanity had endured, a reminder of resilience and unity in the face of unimaginable adversity. As the day of activation approached, tension inside the control center was palpable. Everyone understood the stakes. The transmitter, once completed, would require precise timing, coordination, and protection. The engineer ran simulations, ensuring that signals would reach the intended frequency and overcome any interference. Every calculation was checked multiple times. Every detail mattered. This was not just a machine. It was humanity's voice, its declaration of will against a force that had threatened to erase it. Outside, the world remained under siege. Fires burned in distant cities. Sirens echoed across ruined streets, and the sky was filled with strange, flickering lights. The engineer monitored these events closely, adjusting frequencies, patching connections, and providing updates to teams scattered across the globe. Each successful transmission, each patch of communication was a victory. Every life that could be guided to safety mattered. The final array was humanity's last hope, and the engineer knew that its success depended on every detail being perfect. As night fell, the control center hummed with activity. The engineer moved from station to station, checking equipment, reviewing signals, and coordinating with the military. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on his shoulders. but he drew strength from the team around him. Each person worked tirelessly, driven by the same determination. Humanity would not surrender. They had seen the destruction, experienced the chaos, and understood the cost of failure. Yet they continued to fight, knowing that the final message was more than a signal. It was a promise. In the hours before activation, the engineer took a moment to reflect. He thought of the families scattered across the planet, of children who had never known peace, of ordinary people performing extraordinary acts of courage. The final transmission would carry their voices, their stories, their defiance. It would tell the enemy that humanity would not be broken, no matter the force arrayed against it. And even if the world fell, it would leave a mark, a testament to resilience that could never be erased. Finally, the moment arrived. The transmitter roared to life, systems whirring as it prepared to send the signal. The engineer's voice, steady and resolute, echoed across the facility. To whoever hears this, humanity is alive. We have endured, we have adapted, and we will not surrender. You may strike, you may destroy, but our spirit remains. You will understand that humanity's will cannot be broken. We are watching, we are ready, and you will pay for starting this war. The message began to transmit. Signals shot through space, reaching beyond the atmosphere, beyond the planet, carrying the voice of humanity itself. The engineer monitored every frequency, every watt of energy, ensuring that the transmission remained steady. Outside, explosions rocked distant areas and emergency teams worked frantically. But inside the control center, focus remained absolute. Humanity's voice had to be sent. As the final words were transmitted, the control center fell silent. Monitors showed the outgoing signal stretching into the void. The engineer exhaled slowly, feeling a mix of relief and exhaustion. The message was out. Humanity had spoken. Even if the world around them continued to fall apart, a part of Earth's spirit would travel across the stars, a warning and a declaration in one. The engineer knew the work was not done. The enemy was still out there, and the planet remained vulnerable. But the final transmission was more than a signal. It was a symbol. It was proof that humanity could organize, resist, and fight back even against overwhelming odds. The team around him shared a quiet sense of accomplishment, understanding the significance of what they had achieved. As the night deepened, the engineer looked at the sky. The stars seemed distant yet brighter than ever, each one a reminder of the vast universe they had reached. Somewhere beyond, the message would be received. Somewhere beyond, someone or something would hear humanity's voice. And even as the world continued to burn, even as chaos raged in cities and towns, the engineer felt a small but powerful sense of hope. Humanity had survived the collapse, adapted to the chaos, and made it stand. The final transmission was more than a warning. It was a promise that humanity would endure, a promise that life would continue, a promise that no matter the destruction, the human spirit would remain unbroken. The engineer stayed at his post, watching, monitoring, and ready for whatever came next. The battle was not over, but humanity had made it stand. The final day had arrived. The world outside was scarred. Cities were half destroyed, and communication lines remained fragile at best. Fires still burned in some areas, and the sky was a shifting haze of smoke and strange lights. People moved cautiously through the streets, improvising new ways to communicate, to survive, to stay alive. But inside the control center, the atmosphere was tense, focused, and determined. The engineer and his team had worked tirelessly to get the final transmission ready, and now it was time to send humanity's voice across the stars. The massive transmitter loomed over the facility, humming with energy. Its lights blinked in rhythm with the systems, and the machinery's vibrations could be felt through the floor. Every wire, every relay, every panel had been carefully checked, double-checked, and tested. The engineer walked along its base, observing the final connections, making small adjustments. The weight of responsibility pressed on him like never before. This was more than a machine, it was humanity's last stand. Its declaration that the human spirit could not be crushed. Outside, distant explosions shook the ground, a reminder that the enemy was still active. Energy pulses struck regions nearby, sending debris flying and causing buildings to collapse. Emergency teams and volunteers worked desperately to minimize casualties. The engineer watched the monitors, coordinating the last-minute warnings, sending signals to help guide civilians to safety. Every life mattered. Every moment counted. Humanity's survival depended not only on the message itself but on the ability to protect those who remained on Earth. Inside the control center, the engineers' team moved with precision. Technicians monitored signal integrity, power surges, and system feedback. Scientists calculated frequencies, ensuring that the transmission could pierce the void of space without interference. Military personnel provided security and guidance, ready to act if the enemy attempted to disrupt the operation. The room was tense but focused. Everyone understood that this was the culmination of weeks of struggle, of fear, of adaptation, and of human resilience. The engineer took a deep breath and reviewed the message one last time. Words had been carefully chosen, not to threaten but to declare humanity's will. It was a promise, a warning, and a testament to the courage of those who had survived. His voice would carry across the stars, and somewhere out there someone or something would hear it. He felt the weight of the moment pressing on his chest. Every life on Earth, every act of bravery, every ounce of survival would be represented in this signal. He began the countdown. The room fell silent except for the low hum of the transmitter and the faint beeping of monitors. Everyone held their breath. The engineer's voice, calm but full of emotion, echoed across the control center. "This is humanity speaking. We have endured the impossible. We have adapted, we have survived, and we will not surrender. We may be wounded, but our spirit is unbroken. Whoever has brought this war to our world must understand one thing: humanity will not be defeated. You will pay for starting this war." As the words were transmitted, the engineer watched the monitors. Lines of code, energy patterns, and signal paths moved across the screens. The message was leaving Earth, spreading beyond the atmosphere, reaching into the darkness of space. Every second felt eternal. He could feel the vibrations of the machinery beneath him, the hum of the power systems, and the pulse of determination in the hearts of his team. Humanity's final voice was being sent. Outside, the attacks continued, but for a moment the chaos seemed to fade within the control center. The focus was absolute. Every team member watched the monitors, checked frequencies, and ensured that the signal remained intact. Sparks flew from a nearby panel, and the engineer moved quickly to stabilize it. Nothing could go wrong now. This was the message that would define humanity's defiance, and he would see it through to the end. The transmission spread further, reaching farther distances than anyone had thought possible. Energy pulses from the transmitter cut through the interference, past the remnants of satellites, and into space itself. Somewhere in the darkness, the signal traveled, carrying with it every story of survival, every act of courage, every human heartbeat that refused to be silenced. The engineer knew that it would take time for anyone to respond, but the act itself was monumental. Humanity had made itself heard. As the final lines of the message left the transmitter, the engineer felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. He sank into a chair, breathing heavily, but his mind remained alert. He glanced at the monitors, watching the energy readings slowly stabilize. The transmission had been successful. Humanity's voice had been sent, and for the first time in weeks there was a sense of accomplishment. The world outside was still in danger, but this was a victory, proof that people could come together, coordinate, and act even under impossible circumstances. The engineer allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. He thought of the families scattered across the planet, of the children who had slept in darkness and fear, of the volunteers who had risked their lives to help others. The transmission was for them, a promise that their courage and perseverance mattered. Even if the enemy continued to strike, humanity had left a mark, a message that could not be ignored. Suddenly, alarms blared. Monitors showed energy spikes approaching the facility. The engineer realized that the enemy might be attempting to stop the transmission at the very moment it had been sent. He acted quickly, coordinating with the security team to stabilize the systems. Sparks flew, panels smoked, and the room shook. The team worked in unison, guided by the engineer's calm but urgent instructions. Each second was critical. If the transmitter failed now, the message would be lost, and with it, humanity's last stand. Minutes felt like hours, but the team managed to stabilize the equipment. The alarms ceased, the energy readings returned to normal, and the transmission continued uninterrupted. The engineer exhaled deeply, feeling both relief and renewed determination. Humanity had survived this test, and the message would continue its journey across the stars. It was a moment of triumph amidst the chaos, a reminder that perseverance, coordination, and courage could overcome even the greatest threats. As the transmission completed, the room fell silent. The hum of the machinery was the only sound, accompanied by the engineer's steady breathing. He looked around at his team, their faces tired but filled with quiet pride. They had done something extraordinary. Against overwhelming odds, in the face of relentless attacks, they had ensured that humanity's voice was heard. This was not the end of the war, but it was a turning point, a moment when the human spirit had spoken louder than fear. Outside, the world remained in turmoil. Fires continued to burn, distant explosions shook buildings, and communication lines were still fragile. But somewhere in the midst of this chaos, the final transmission was moving through space. It carried the courage, resilience, and determination of an entire planet. It carried the message that humanity would not surrender, that life and spirit could not be erased, and that every act of bravery mattered. The engineer sat quietly, reflecting on the weeks that had passed. The first strike, the collapse of communication, the final preparations, everything had led to this moment. He felt exhaustion like he had never known, but also a profound sense of purpose. Humanity had been tested, and it had responded with courage, ingenuity, and unity. The final transmission was a testament to that truth, a reminder that even in the darkest times, people could rise, adapt, and endure. In the following hours, the engineer continued to monitor the transmitter, ensuring that signals remained stable and that emergency networks continued to function. The world outside might have been in chaos, but inside the control center, a sense of calm determination had settled. Humanity had spoken, and the act of sending the message had strengthened the resolve of everyone involved. As dawn approached, the first light breaking through the smoke and haze, the engineer allowed himself a brief moment of hope. The final transmission had been sent, and somewhere, far beyond Earth, it was traveling through the vast darkness of space. Humanity's voice would be heard. It was not a threat, it was a promise, a declaration of resilience, and a testament to the courage of those who had survived. Even as the world remained in peril, the engineer felt a sense of connection to every person who had fought, survived, and endured. The transmission was a symbol of all they had achieved, a reminder that no matter how dire the circumstances, humanity could act with purpose, bravery, and unity. It was the last transmission from Earth, but it carried something far greater than a message. It carried the heart and spirit of an entire planet. The world outside was a shadow of its former self. Cities still smoldered, communication networks were fragile, and humanity had learned to survive in pockets. Fires flickered across ruined landscapes, and the sky glowed faintly from distant explosions. Yet amid the chaos, there was a quiet sense of determination. People were no longer running blindly. They had adapted, organized, and found ways to keep moving forward. Humanity had endured the first strikes, survived the collapse of communication, and sent its final transmission. Now all that remained was to wait. Inside the control center, the engineer watched the monitors with unwavering focus. The final transmission was still traveling through space, a thread of hope connecting Earth to the unknown beyond. He checked readings, confirmed signal stability, and coordinated with emergency teams. The weight of the past weeks pressed heavily on him, but he drew strength from the resilience he saw around him. Every small victory, every life saved, every message delivered had shown that humans were capable of extraordinary endurance. Reports began to filter in from the remaining cities and towns. People had started to rebuild basic networks, relaying information through radios, runners, and improvised signals. Schools were repurposed as temporary shelters, and local leaders organized community watches to maintain safety. Even in the darkness, life persisted. Families reunited where possible, sharing food, water, and hope. The engineer felt a surge of pride and relief. Humanity had faced annihilation and had not faltered, yet the threat was not gone. Energy readings indicated that the enemy was still active, observing and possibly learning from human responses. Satellites, where any remained, picked up faint pulses from beyond the solar system. The engineer realized that this war was far from over. Survival depended not only on adaptation but also on understanding the enemy, anticipating its moves, and ensuring that humanity remained vigilant. Every decision, every action, every effort mattered. The first real sign of response came as a subtle fluctuation in the signal the engineer had been monitoring. It was small at first, almost imperceptible, but it was deliberate. The final transmission had been received, or at least intercepted. The realization sent a chill through the control center. Humanity had reached out into the void, and something somewhere had noticed. The room filled with quiet tension. No one knew what the response meant, whether it was a threat, a warning, or acknowledgement. But the engineer understood the significance. Earth was no longer alone in the fight. The days that followed were filled with a mixture of vigilance and hope. Emergency networks continued to operate, guiding survivors, distributing supplies, and coordinating reconstruction efforts. The engineer remained at his station, decoding faint signals, analyzing anomalies, and preparing for any potential counterattacks. He knew that while humanity had sent its message, the universe was vast and unpredictable. Every precaution was necessary. Humanity's resilience became more apparent as survivors began to innovate in unexpected ways. Communities developed manual systems for communication and transport, using bicycles, runners, and signal fires. Local workshops repaired equipment and built improvised defenses. People shared knowledge and resources, creating networks of cooperation that stretched across neighborhoods and regions. Even in the absence of global communication, humans found ways to stay connected, to organize, and to persevere. One night, as the engineer reviewed incoming signals, he noticed patterns that suggested the enemy was reconsidering its strategy. The energy pulses had shifted slightly, less destructive and more observational. It was as if they were assessing human responses, studying patterns, and perhaps realizing that Earth was not as defenseless as they had assumed. The engineer shared this information with military and scientific teams. It was cautious optimism, but it was hope nonetheless. Humanity had survived. Humanity had adapted. And now, there was a chance that survival might continue. Across the planet, people began to emerge from shelters, cautiously exploring the ruins of their cities. They cleared debris, salvaged supplies, and helped neighbors rebuild what they could. Children, once hidden in basements and makeshift shelters, played in small groups, their laughter a reminder of life continuing despite the destruction. The engineer monitored these developments through scattered signals, feeling a profound sense of connection to the people he had never met, yet whose survival had been tied to his work. The final transmission had become more than a message. It was a symbol of human spirit. Communities shared stories of the transmission's impact, of hope rekindled, and of the courage to continue even when faced with overwhelming fear. People spoke of the engineer and the team who had risked everything to ensure humanity's voice was heard, though few knew their names. Their work had united humanity in a way that no disaster had before. It was a reminder that even in the darkest times, people could act with purpose, resilience, and unity. Weeks passed, and subtle changes in the enemy's behavior became more apparent. Energy pulses were less frequent, strikes less targeted. It was unclear whether this was due to human adaptation, strategic reassessment, or some unknown reason. Regardless, humanity had gained a reprieve, however fragile. The engineer, while remaining vigilant, allowed himself to feel a small measure of relief. The planet was still scarred, but it had endured. Human life persisted, and that persistence was a victory in itself. In the control center, the engineer took a rare moment to step outside. The city, though partially destroyed, was quiet under a sky slowly clearing of smoke and flickering lights. Survivors moved cautiously through the streets, working together to rebuild what they could. There was no fanfare, no celebrations, just quiet determination and a shared understanding that survival required cooperation and courage. The engineer felt a deep sense of pride and humility. Humanity had faced a threat it could barely comprehend, yet it had endured through ingenuity, resilience, and unity. As days turned into weeks, communication lines continued to be patched and repaired. Survivors shared news of distant communities, of improvised governance, of food distribution, and of efforts to protect those still vulnerable. Even without global networks, humanity had found ways to stay connected. The engineer watched the progress with cautious optimism. The final transmission had been a turning point, a reminder that even when the odds were insurmountable, human courage could prevail. Then, one day, a stronger signal returned. It was brief, fragmented, but unmistakable, a response to the final transmission. The control center erupted into careful excitement. Analysts worked to decode it, while the engineer coordinated the interpretation. The signal suggested acknowledgement and possibly retreat from the enemy. It was not victory yet, but it was the first indication that humanity's message had been heard and that the attackers had reconsidered their approach. Humanity began to recover. Survivors moved to rebuild cities, restore essential services, and reclaim a sense of normalcy. Schools, hospitals, and markets reopened, albeit cautiously. Communities that had been isolated during the collapse reconnected, sharing resources, skills, and knowledge. People celebrated survival quietly, understanding that the real victory was continued existence, and the opportunity to rebuild stronger and more united than before. The engineer remained at the control center, monitoring signals and coordinating with the last active networks. He had learned that survival was not about avoiding fear or destruction. It was about responding with courage, resilience, and purpose. Humanity had endured not because it was invincible, but because people had refused to surrender, had adapted, and had acted together in the face of unimaginable threats. At night, as he looked at the stars, the engineer reflected on what had happened. The final transmission had been more than a message. It had been a declaration of spirit, a warning, and a symbol of unity. Somewhere beyond Earth, it had carried the voice of millions, telling the universe that humanity would not be erased. The response, however faint, confirmed that the voice had been heard. It was proof that courage and determination could resonate even across the vast distances of space. The world was forever changed, but there was hope. Humanity had survived its first true test against an incomprehensible enemy. Communication, cooperation, and courage had proven stronger than fear, isolation, and chaos. People had acted selflessly, defended their communities, and ensured that life persisted. And through it all, the engineer remained a silent guardian, ensuring that the last threads of connection, guidance, and hope stayed alive. As Earth slowly healed, people told stories of those terrifying weeks, of the first strike, the collapse of communication, the relentless attacks, and the final transmission that carried humanity's spirit across the stars. Children grew up hearing how ordinary people performed extraordinary acts, how communities united, and how survival depended on courage, ingenuity, and hope. The engineer's work became part of that legacy, a symbol of human resilience in the face of cosmic threats. In the end, humanity had endured. Cities would be rebuilt, communication networks restored, and life would return to the streets, but the lessons of the attacks remained. People had learned the fragility of existence, the importance of unity, and the power of the human spirit. And far beyond Earth, in the endless darkness of space, a signal,